Yeah, that's pretty peaceful, isn't it? Well, on top of being peaceful, these places and rivers often hide a lot of fish, but this is nothing new to you guys. So today I want to dive in and talk about some subtle spots that you could be fishing on your river that are going to be areas where the vast majority of people simply aren't fishing enough. And because these spots aren't so obvious, they get a lot less pressure, and usually for me that means we have a chance of finding a better quality fish overall. So when we talk about these spots, our goal in fishing them isn't necessarily to catch numbers, but it's to catch bigger fish. But before I start sharing the ingredients to the secret sauce, I want to talk about the obvious areas here. Rapids areas like this are going to be fish attractors for the large majority of the year. And right now, during the late summer, they become even more important as river levels drop, things move more slowly. These areas are going to be a source of oxygenation, and they're generally areas where the substrate or the bottom composition is something that smallmouth bass like. Now we do have to clarify that not all rapids are created equally. I just like the ones that provide some sort of variation, whether that's with current speed, depth, substrate, or bottom composition. I tend to find the best fish in an area that has a wide variety of types of water or depths.
Big one.
So there are no real secrets here in this rapids area. It just has a lot of a couple things I like. It's got different speeds of water, and it's got really drastic depth changes, and I think that attracts bigger fish.
Oh, it's another giant, dude. It's another giant. The big ones are on fire. This thing is huge.
So while fishing the downstream side of these areas is obviously going to be very productive throughout most of the year, one thing I don't want you to forget about is the upstream areas, because the bottom composition doesn't just change right at the rapids. That same rock is also present on the upstream side of the rapids. Having said that, I do want to talk about the upstream side a little bit because there are some big fish spots to be found there as well. So we all know as we approach a rapids, the water gets progressively more shallow. But if we can find those pockets of depth in that shallow water above the rapids, those are going to be bigger fish locations in my experience. But they're not that numerous. So you do need to use your eyes, slow down, and fish around until you really get comfortable with where they are so you can fish them from a distance.
That's a chunky one. Man.
So now that we've covered the more obvious big fish spots, let's get to those other more subtle areas that I think a lot of people are passing over. So to do this, we're going to zoom out and take a macro view of the river, and what we're looking at here is a stretch of the river that is dominated by sand. But we know this sand changes to rock at some point because we have that rapids downstream. And of course, if we zoom out on an area like this, we're going to see a lot of rock from above. And clearly there has to be some sort of transition between the two. However, the obvious transition doesn't start where you can see the rock very clearly from above. It starts a lot more subtly further upstream. For the purposes of this video, I'm going to call these areas transition zones, but what I'm actually wanting you guys to look for is the transition to the transition. I realize that sounds a little silly, but let me explain what I mean with this example here in front of us. I am looking for the first instance of just a couple scattered rocks before the more obvious transition downstream. So in other words, when the river drastically changes its character and it goes from sand to rock, I am looking for the very first instance of that rock, and this could be a very, very small area, but as we move downstream, that rock becomes more and more consistent and dominant. And I think these areas often get passed over because most people see the transition as happening a little further downstream and don't realize that on a lot of rivers, these transitions can happen very slowly and subtly beneath the surface where you simply aren't looking. So let's go ahead and jump into our next example. This stretch of river here is dominated by sand, but if you look downstream, there is a turn where the gradient increases, the flow increases, and there is also a good amount of rock. However, here you'll notice that I'm casting well upstream of that transition, and what I'm looking for is that subtle change that happens before the more obvious transition occurs. So So you may have noted there that there's not a whole lot that's special about this spot, and I even caught that fish out in the middle of the river. And I do want to comment right now on conditions. I do think that cloudy, overcast conditions are a little more conducive to fish being out in the center channel like this. However, if this fish was not there, I would want to look in the areas that have the wood that are above the transition, because any sort of attractive cover near a transition is going to be a good spot to find fish. This next example here is to prove that point exactly. We have a very similar turn, a very similar transition from a little slower water to faster water paired with a lot of rock. But instead of finding that transition where it is most obvious, I'm looking in a turn above it where there is some really attractive wood cover with a little bit of depth present. Alright, so I know I've been talking about those upstream transition zones, but I do want to point out that they usually exist downstream too, so you don't want to limit what you're looking for to just the upstream side. So let's go ahead and take a look downstream at an example of one of these subtle changes that yields a really good fish. And just so you know what you're looking at while I'm heading downstream here, this is an area below a very strong rapids. The depth gets down to about 9 or 10 feet at the very end of it, and then it slowly starts to come up. But when it does come up, the depth change is pretty drastic and it goes to just 1 or 2 feet. And I'm not actually fishing the obvious transition, I'm fishing a different transition that is within a section of river that has clearly changed its character from just upstream.
Wow, that's not where I expected one to be. Drops down to like 8 feet right there. I was like, I'll try it. I've always fished the bank here.
Is it over here?
Nice one. Overshot it. It's just a nice little transition from like 3 or 4 feet down to 8. Not even on the bank, just kind of cast it over it.
And what you can't see here a little further downstream is that this change was the first in a series of changes along this bank where the water went from 2 to 3 to let's say 5 or 6 feet, but out in the main channel, the river was completely dominated by 1 to 2 feet of depth. So I guess at the end of the day, we can simplify this by saying bass are certainly drawn to transitions. However, how we look at those transitions is going to dictate how many fish we catch, in my opinion, because I think the more obvious transitions are going to pull a lot of anglers' attention and they're going to miss those subtle changes that happen before the drastic change. And if we apply this approach to different transitions throughout the river, I think we're going to catch a lot more big fish. Let's look at one last example to prove my point here. I have a very flat stretch of river that's very shallow. It does start to speed up and get a little bit deeper up on this right side. And you'll notice that there's a big tree that's acting as a current break, and there is a lot of noticeable depth behind that. But notice I'm not going down beneath the tree. I'm staying on top of it because that's that really gradual, that really subtle transition to the deeper spot that's not quite as obvious to the eye. But when you also take into account the surrounding cover, then it becomes something that you really want to fish because that cut bank just screams big fish.